Welcome to Reinventors and the Reinvent America series, where this week we're going to be reinventing technology to stop Ebola. I'm Peter Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinventors and the host of this series. Now, stopping the spread of Ebola is a complex problem, but it's definitely a solvable one. And it's particularly solvable because it's happening now in the early part of the 21st century, when we've got a bunch of technologies, an array of technologies that did not exist, let's say, 50 years ago or even 20 years ago. We've got whole industries now, nanotechnology, biotechnology, that have only really risen up in the last 20 years, and we've got new developments in information technologies like big data and others that can be used even in ways that we couldn't even imagine 10 or 15 years ago. So one issue, and the issue we're going to be looking at here, one problem we're going to be thinking about is how do you get these new technologies quickly into the field, because this is a fast-moving potential pandemic. And there are many well-meaning processes that the federal government has put in place to test new technologies, new techniques. And in normal times, these are, really good ways that safeguard the public interest, the public health, and are good procedures. But when you're actually facing the potential of a pandemic and things are moving fast, those same processes can really slow down the process so much and kind of gum up our response time here. So what can we actually do about this? And I think this is an issue. It's not just about the Ebola question, because in fact this is something we got to, I think, increasingly deal with in the coming decades here, because Ebola might not be the only pandemic we're going to see in the coming years ahead here. Now, the other good thing about this being held in 2014 is we can use this new technology of interactive group video to actually bring together the right mix of people to actually work on this problem, to try to solve this problem in real time. That's what we can do here at Reinventors. And our partners in this Reinvent America series, Tech for America, or T4A.org, they're really the perfect kind of partners for this too. Now, this is a group of technologists, entrepreneurs based in Silicon Valley and Seattle, who have really been working on how do we improve the relationships between the public and private sector, really to work for the common good, which is better understanding. And so they've been able to work with us to pull together an awesome group, a really terrific, just top-notch group here of folks to work on this problem. And we've got folks from inside the federal government. We've got people from the White House, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. We've got some top technology entrepreneurs from technology companies here, and we've got some global health experts, public health experts that in this mix can actually work on this problem. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to go around the table right now, and we're going to basically just have everyone introduce themselves, a little bit of who they are, what they bring to the table, and we'll get into the conversation right away. So, Garrett, do you want to basically just introduce yourself and say a little bit about what you're doing in this field?
Good morning. My name is Garrett Gruener. I'm a venture capitalist and entrepreneur. I have a background in entrepreneurship and in public policy, and was one of the founders of Alta Partners, which is a very large life science-oriented venture firm. These days I invest. Specifically, I'm currently chairman of Nanōmix, which is a point-of-care diagnostics company I'll talk about in a moment.
Great to have you here. And we got Garrett coming in from Colorado. Claudia, do you want to just introduce yourself and what you have to do here with this issue?
Sure, thanks. I serve as Senior Advisor for Health Technology and Innovation in the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. And my background is really in health information tech and how we can use policy to create the conditions for innovation broadly across healthcare. I guess I just want to also mention a few things that the CTO's office does within the broader U.S. government environment. One thing is that we've been spearheading along with OMB, bringing in top digital talent into government, and this was kind of started with the, I think many of us who've come in, but also the healthcare.gov redesign. But we have been bringing in top tech talent that are not only helping solve our problems, but also helping us identify places where we may need to work in different ways with the private sector. Also, I think a key role that we play is convening outside and inside innovators, whether it's through data jams or hackathons or roundtables, or actually co-creating with people in the public what the solutions need to be. I think that the traditional way to work is to kind of be in your silo and work, but we're really trying to change that. And finally, to help coach teams across the government in both policies and practices that spur innovation. So whether that's agile techniques or opening up data as fuel for innovation, really thinking about our role as capacity builders both within government and to kind of use government powers to spur more innovation on the outside.
Awesome. It's great to have you in from Washington. Stephen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, everybody, and hello from Washington, D.C. Steve VanRoekel. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at USAID, and was, for the last 3 years, spent about 20 years in the private sector in technology. In the last 3 years, was the U.S. Chief Information Officer in the White House before about 4 weeks ago moving over to USAID. USAID, the Agency for International Development, actually leads the U.S. government's response on many crises around the world, including Ebola. So we have a team on the ground in West Africa called the Disaster Assistance Response Team that coordinates all the NGO activities, the international activities, and coordinates the activities of the U.S. military. One thing to note is, as of this week, we just added another member of the DART team in Liberia called the Innovation Cell, and this gentleman is tasked with really taking innovative ideas to the field to ground truth them and test them across multiple axes where we're focusing on technology and innovation, such as point-of-care technologies and rapid diagnostics, looking at communications in the ICT sector in the country, as well as thinking about how do we use data to best effect, both in kind of data on the impact, as well as looking at epidemiological and research data and other big data sources to pull that in to understand more about the disease, learn more about it, and then understand where to deploy resources and to get our arms around it. As we get through the conversation today, I'd love to share some information about what we're finding that's working on the ground and some of the unique challenges of working in an environment like West Africa. Thank you.
Awesome. Just great to have your experience in here. The other Stephen, sorry, we've got two Stevens here too, so we're going to take the Steve with PH, come in from Washington.
Hi, good morning. It's Steve Morrison from CSIS. I work at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a international security and foreign policy think tank. I'm a political scientist. I'm an Africanist. We run a large program here on global health policy, which I direct. As far as technology, we've paid quite a bit of attention to the role that technology's played in different settings. Just yesterday, we had Tony Fauci and two others here talking about the HIV vaccine and status of that and efforts over the last few years and looking forward. In terms of Ebola, here in Washington, this is such a multi-sectoral and fast-moving picture, and it's one where U.S. leadership has leaped forward in a sudden way, starting with the President's September 16th announcement. It's a complicated picture. It's moved forward reasonably well. Our role is largely in convening diverse folks, both in closed-door sessions and public sessions. We'll be doing a session November 19th on the economic impacts. We'll be doing one in mid-December on the technology that we're talking about today. But thank you, Peter, for the chance to be here with you.
Awesome. Great to have you. Kevin, jump in.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Kevin Montgomery from Stanford University, the Center for Innovation and Global Health. That's kind of my academic life. Formerly, I was working with the U.S. Army Medical Research Materiel Command as a portfolio manager for biosensors, biosurveillance, and disaster management. So I've also had a bit of a role in government. In my portfolio, we were actually funding a lot of projects and a lot of technologies in biosensors, biosurveillance, disaster management, with an eye on some of the things that we're talking about today. Outside of the academic and government roles, I'm also a serial entrepreneur, and one of the companies that I've created just over the last few years is trying to solve the challenge of getting data from anywhere on the planet to anywhere else. And we basically make a device that allows you to plug any kind of sensor or diagnostic device into it, transmit that data from anywhere in the world, and be able to get it back to a central server. Then you can access that data online. Part of what we've learned, though, is it's more than just diagnostic and sensor data that you need. You actually need all information about a place brought together into one location. So we're spinning out the website now, collaborate.org, which basically does massive data fusion. It has over 2 million layers of data from sensors, social media, satellite imagery, databases of other information, etc., brought together, put at your fingertips, along with a bunch of collaboration tools. So we can do things exactly like what we're trying to do here today, which is get all of these people, no matter where they are, anywhere on the planet, together to solve this problem in this place. So it's a secure website, tons of data, collaboration tools, and mobile situational awareness tools as well. So what we're talking about today, obviously, is something I'm pretty passionate about, empowering people to make better decisions and get together on the same page to address these huge global challenges. Thank you.
Awesome. Great to have you. Michael, jump in.
Yeah, good day. My name is Michael Kleeman. I'm with the University of California at San Diego, the Institute for Global Conflict and Cooperation, and also the volunteer partner to the President for Humanitarian Services at the American Red Cross. And the focus that we've been looking at is the utilization of different technologies, specifically mobile, in disaster preparedness and response and panic preparedness and response. And in West Africa, we've been working, I guess now for around 4 years with some of the providers on using different technologies to enable hotspot location as well as patient tracking, et cetera. One of the things that my colleagues and I at UCSD think is important is that Ebola is raising a lot of awareness and visibility right now, but that we ought to think about this as an opportunity to prepare for the next incident that occurs. Ebola may not be, hopefully, a pandemic that affects the United States materially, but there is likely to be one day. And using this, if you will, as a rehearsal, we think is really important. And I'll discuss a little later a little bit of the impediments that we're seeing toward deploying technologies in some of these markets.
Awesome. Great to have you here. And then Sam rounds it out. Oops, you're muted, Sam. Just unmute. Oops. Sam, we're having trouble. You got to unmute in the upper hand there. There you go. Oop. There you go. Go.
Okay. Sam Bozzette, I'm an infectious diseases physician by training and a policy analyst, formerly from RAND and at UCSD, where I teach a course in public policy and biologic threats. And for the last few months, I've been vice president of medical affairs at bioMerieux, which is a leading diagnostics company, and in fact has just received an EUA, emergency use application, for a point-of-care Ebola PCR test.
Awesome. Okay, and as great as this group is, I will say there's folks watching on our website in the G+ environment. You can comment there, ask questions. You can also, if you're on Twitter, using hashtag Reinventors, ask questions there. We have people watching it. We may cycle in some of the questions, and if not, we will definitely package it in with all our write-ups and videos at the end of this process. So do give your ideas. Garrett, let's start off right now is you've got a company and a diagnostic tool that, why don't you just tee up kind of what you're doing and a little bit of some of the things that you're running into just to start the conversation, and we'll kind of roll around with the rest of the folks.
Great. Well, again, I'm chairman of Nanōmix, which is a point-of-care diagnostics company. And we've been working for over 10 years now on the development of a point-of-care diagnostic platform. One of the things that we did, in essence, as a Skunks Works, was to do a panel that was Ebola, Lassa, and dengue, which was tested in Sierra Leone 2 years ago. As is often the case, that was not, of course, our main commercial objective, and we're focused on the development of a cardiac panel. But when you have a problem like this, you know, it's all hands to the doors, and by definition, you're scrambling, looking to how to use technology to adapt to the problem. So what I wanted to do was just spend a couple of minutes describing what that technology is, but really I mean it as an example. There's more than one company that has been working in this area, and the problem for the federal government is to figure out how to quickly take advantage of that technology. So if I could have the first slide. Hello? Can I get the first slide up?
Yeah, the slide is up to the folks watching, and you just click on that. Yeah.
So just a little bit about the technology. This is a nanotechnology-based sensor in which what we're doing essentially is using nanotechnology to have a very accurate solid-state sensor for looking for proteins or antigens. In this case, obviously, the Ebola. We're looking for the Ebola antigen. But we're looking for multiple things simultaneously, which turns out to be very important in this environment. The one that we did was looking for Lassa, dengue, and Ebola. And even today, in the 3 affected countries, there is more Lassa and dengue than there is Ebola, and certainly there's more malaria. And so being able to discriminate amongst those is very important. You go to the next slide. We take that sensor and package it up into a microfluidic cartridge, which contains all of the reagents so that we can start with whole blood and get our answer in 10 minutes. We take the cartridge, which is pictured here on the right of the slide, and if we can go to the next slide, that is then inserted into our reader. The reader it basically has a user interface which simply asks the operator to obviously first put the blood into the cartridge, put the cartridge into the reader, and press go. 10 minutes later, we know whether or not the patient is testing positive for any of the 3 diseases that we're looking for. The reader contains within it both a barcode scanner, which is important for patient tracking, and also Bluetooth communications, so that we can take the information and send it on to whatever central server is keeping track of this, keeping track of the data. We go to the next slide. This is actually the data on our troponin panel, which was in the cardiac area. But the point I simply want to make to this is what we're trying to do is offer the same level of performance, sensitivity, and accuracy as one sees in the central lab. Here we're compared to the Siemens Centaur, which is what you'd expect in the one of the devices you'd expect in the basement of a major American hospital, and we have an R-squared of 0.99, indicating effectively we're producing the exact same results. We go to the next slide. This is actually the data from our the small trial that we did in conjunction with Tulane in Sierra Leone. Thankfully, at that time, we didn't have any Ebola positive patients, but we did have dengue and Lassa positive patients, and the agreement with the later tests was, 100%. The folks in Tulane are doing the work here on the actual test itself, and have been tuning it up now in Sierra Leone and Liberia based upon the actual strains of Ebola that they're seeing. And so we expect to see equally good results from that. Next slide. This is being done in conjunction with a consortium of folks, the Tulane folks who I mentioned, various other people around the country, people who are located in the affected regions, Corgenix, which is our partner working on a lateral flow version of these tests, and so on. Next slide. The basic thing that we have proposed to the U.S. government is essentially to move very swiftly on this, to begin production now, to use the FDA's new approval for emergency use authorizations, and to basically continue the development along the way. And that really is where I want to conclude, is that when you have a problem like this, in some sense, the right answer for the federal government is yes. What it should do is do multiple things simultaneously, giving people contracts to actually build real things that are at a scale that matters, and then figure out in the field what you want to use.
Interesting. That's awesome. Thank you, Garrett. Sam, you want to jump in? You have a comment on basic on this? I mean, because I know there's other technologies as well in this kind of space, but go ahead, Sam.
Well, I think there's also the whole regulatory aspect of it. Well, there are two things. One is that we need to be very adaptable. The BioFire platform that I had mentioned previously was developed by DoD. It has 18 pathogens it looks at, but but it was not it could not directly be put in the field because most of the pathogens aren't licensed use. They're used by military only. But there was a possibility here of blocking the results of the other pathogens and getting an emergency use authorization for just the Ebola component. And so I think flexibility in terms of developing things, but also flexibility in adapting things that already exist to these emerging situations.
Totally hear you. Do others want to just, as we start the conversation here, are there other kind of opportunities here that that we might want to just tee up and then get into some of the processes to make it better? Okay, Claudia, do you want to jump in here? You had a thought right away.
Yeah, and the example I'm going to cite, we're in close partnership with USAID, so Steve may want to jump in too. But I just wanted to, there's clearly an abundance of important work to be done in therapies, diagnostics, and vaccines. But when we think more broadly about the Ebola response, one key problem that's been really preoccupying people is how to support and keep safe the healthcare workers that are serving both from the countries that are affected and from here as well. And in particular, the problem of the protective equipment that heats folks up to such a degree that they can only work 45-minute shifts. And here's an example where you have an existing technology, an outfit that's been in use for a long time, but it doesn't suit the needs that are presenting itself. USAID in September launched a grand challenge for development asking for the best ideas from the world and how we could quickly iterate and produce better solutions. We hosted a 2-day event along with them that wasn't your typical roundtable federal government event. It ended up in a 1-day prototyping session at a tech lab in Virginia where teams actually prototyped with the end users. One team created a new outfit that was like a wetsuit. You entered from the back. You had pull tabs. They iterated it several times with 3D printers with the MSF specialists helping that guide their solutions. And the idea is that the best solutions will be funded very soon, and we will rapidly, USAID will lead the rapid testing and fielding of solutions within months. I'm pointing this out because this seems like a kind of mundane problem. It turns out it's really important, and we need to find new ways like this where we actually start early conversations with innovators between the government and the private sector. And frankly, we had DIY bio people participate. We had makers. We had hackers from Fortune 500 companies. We had PPE manufacturers, right? We need such a broad mix of brains in the pool. And then we need to have mechanisms to rapidly fund, and not just that, but rapidly test solutions. When we first talked to PPE manufacturers, they said, well, that's going to take at least a year. And then we started drilling down and talking more, we realized it really could be done in a couple months, in a few months, and still meet the safety requirements and the kind of testing requirements you would want it to do. So I'm only giving this as an example. I think often we have to kind of almost pick apart our processes and figure out how we need to put them back together to enable a more rapid response. Thank you.
That's awesome. Well, actually, that's Stephen from USAID. You mentioned USAID. I mean, are you finding a similar thing, or talk? Maybe you could build off of what she's basically saying there.
Yeah, I think the part of our challenge, and I'd love people's thoughts on this, is when this crisis happened, there were just unending numbers of people that came out and approached us and talked a little bit about the solutions they would have or different things that could be made available. Part of our challenge is sort of digging through all of that and understanding what's the best and highest potential to move the ball forward. I can tell you on diagnostics, we've probably seen hundreds of people come up with proposals and talking about their ideas and different things like that. What we've chosen to do is work with one, the science agencies in government that have domain expertise in this area, as well as experts in the NGO community to really narrow them down. I can commit to everyone on rapid diagnostics that we are going to adhere to the law. We are not going to adhere to the rules, and so as we look at opportunities to go things as fast as humanly possible, we will take advantage of those opportunities to do that and to drive those forward.
Just could you expand on that one thing you just said there, Stephen? Is you're going to adhere to the laws but not to the rules? I mean, to what extent can you do that, and to what extent do you think you have sufficient elbow room there to really react quickly on this stuff?
Well, I think that some of the other speakers mentioned some of the emergency authorizations that are available. Those are used a lot during crises like this, where you need to move things very quickly. And what that really kind of prescribes is the ability to go in and procure things to buy, for the government to fund or buy things that normally would take more of a long-term kind of competitive process for our procurement rules. And I don't want to get into depth on that, but it basically allows us to move very, very quickly. And we also have the ability through USAID, through things like the Grand Challenge that Claudia mentioned, to actually go out and fund projects that are happening on the outside. So we're looking at opportunities to fund rapid diagnostic testing programs, to fund PPE manufacturers to build these hazmat-like suits for the field, and kind of reimagine all kinds of technology in the space. And you may have seen yesterday the president submitted a supplemental budget request, and part of that is part of this innovation agenda and having funding to go and drive some of this forward.
So from the technologist side, okay, Kevin, you've got a technology. Tee up. You react to this too.
Sure. So I was just going to step back. I'm really enjoying the conversation, but I wanted to step back and kind of get the big picture at 100,000 feet. So what I'm hearing is that we have a bunch of different technologies that we need: diagnostics and sensors, mobile situational awareness tools so that workers on the ground can know what's happening. We've talked about other collaboration tools, vaccines and tests and technologies, even including like water or liquid cooling garments for inside of hazmat suits. We've also talked a bit about policy and process and being able to get all those things together. So what I'm really finding is, if I step way back, it sounds like what we're talking about is access and integration of all kinds of data, from diagnostic devices, people in the field that are accessing all that information and integrating it together so we understand what's happening out there. Second to that is really the ability to coordinate action across a bunch of organizations and a bunch of people, and support their ability to collaborate both inside of their own organization would be refreshing for some of the organizations that I think we all work with, but increasingly with people external, because we have people all over the world that really need to get together on the same page and be able to coordinate their actions. Like what Claudia was mentioning a moment ago, rapid access to new technologies, no matter whether it's in government, academia, industry, or working with NGOs, etc., being able to rapidly bring all of those people together and get them working together on the same page. So just to step back to the big picture, it sounds like access and integrate lots of data together, coordinate actions across organizations that are geographically disparate in government, academia, and industry is kind of what I'm hearing as the general role here. So I just wanted to share those comments.
Liking that. Sam, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, with the 10,000-foot view, one thing that we don't want to neglect is process. I think we need we've been talking about stuff, but we also need innovation in processing. Teaching people how to take on and off their suits, the very fundamentals of medical care. How do you handle people who are having terrible diarrhea and vomiting and not contaminate yourself? Those sorts of things as well. And I'd like to hear some discussion of how you move beyond stuff into the total care environment.
I think process, policy, and human capacity, just to build off that.
Okay, why don't we go to Michael, and then we'll go to Stephen, and then Garrett. Go ahead.
Yeah, I second the comment about the conversation being really important and interesting. The dimension I wanted to bring up was the issue of working in nations other than the United States and dealing with both the cultural changes and differences, but also the national political and private sector constraints. Very often, we go in with really good intentions and expecting a lot of cooperation, and some of it is not as forthcoming as one would like. And therefore, the ability to field these resources and tools and capabilities sometimes either is compromised because of skill base or effectiveness or lack of basic infrastructure like power or communications, and also institutional inertia on the part of governments and private sector players like power companies or mobile communications providers. And we've been seeing that specifically in West Africa now for 5 years, where we've been just trying to work with the mobile providers and getting very simple access to the ability to track people around the country using mobile data. And my concern is not just what happens there, but if we had to do that in the United States, we'd probably end up with a very similar kind of objection from the major operators here, even though it could be life-saving.
Stephen, jump in.
Thank you. Listening to Garrett and Sam's presentations was quite fascinating because there's been a lot of reporting around those diagnostics and getting permission to move ahead rapidly and the like. And what I wanted to focus in on is we're in a period of very intensified urgent action across a spectrum of technologies: vaccines, therapies, diagnostics, medical products, PPEs, things like that. And it's coming against a backdrop of a fairly low and languishing period, low level, low activity level in some respects, or slow evolution. And as we go into this very urgent basis, all sorts of questions come up. And on the case of the two diagnostics, folks are asking questions around sensitivity and accuracy that you can point to, costs, whether you require cold chain, whether it's going to be reliable, or whether they're going to have a minimal false positives, and how dependent are you upon transport infrastructure and ability to be mobile over a period of time in a highly uncertain and rugged environment. Maybe you could each comment on that spectrum of issues that enter every evaluation around what's happening on these point-of-care diagnostics, which look very promising.
Garrett, why don't you go, and Sam? I'd love to hear from both of you.
So I think that thank you, Stephen, for the question. I think that's exactly the the right question, obviously, to pose to any new device in this category. And to the other Stephen from USAID, I am deeply sympathetic to the fact that there are many technologies that potentially are relevant. And the problem from government standpoint, in my humble opinion, is how do you sort through that rapidly? And I would add, how do you deal with the enormous impedance mismatch between little companies, which tend to be the reservoirs of these technologies, and the government, which is so massive? And the problem is that typically small companies can't afford to maintain this conversation. It's very expensive to talk to the government, and we are at the moment literally talking to probably 6 different agencies of the U.S. government simultaneously, having a staff of 25 people, and only one of them who has time to do this kind of thing. And with the odds being low that any of them will produce anything, which therefore affects the main line of our program. So the real reason for my comments, indeed for my reason for being on this call, is that regardless of Nanōmix, there's a large reservoir of companies in the same place, and we need the ability to do what I would call a rapid technology deployment force for situations like this, where whoever is acting on point can very rapidly do the analysis that needs to be done and deploy the dollars that need to be deployed in order to not only do testing of the devices, but also deployment of the devices, manufacturing of the devices, which is a big challenge.
It sounds like Stephen or Claudia maybe, and Stephen want to respond to that, and then we'll go to Sam.
Sure. I guess just 3 quick thoughts, not altogether related. I think there are another range of government ways in which government can promote innovation. An example for the FDA is last year they announced a list of mobile medical devices for which they would not be actively regulating. These are low-risk devices. They're mostly patient-facing. And so taking a risk-based approach to any number of different domains is another way where you can create clarity so that a small company doesn't have to hire a lawyer to ask that question. It's right there in front of them and they can move forward. Obviously that's going to be appropriate, and that particular solution won't be appropriate in every case, but it's a very interesting pathway. A second just thought bubble is, if there was a way to, this is a challenging space because companies are coming forward with ideas that represent IP for them. But if there was some more public way to kind of combine and vet and figure out the best ideas, because, in some ways our traditional pathways to do that, which is procurement and formal testing, do take longer. And I'm just asking the group whether we could imagine a different way of doing this that might still adequately protect the share, but protect at the same time. And a third point is just, and this is an area in which we're, again, working very closely with Steve, and they're leading the charge and really asking, how can you create a baseline of connectivity, mobile as well as internet, to support some of these key technologies, especially in the ETUs and CCCs in West Africa. So kind of thinking about what those backbones are going to be for all of our innovation, and how do we make sure we're building out that infrastructure that will remain behind even as we tackle these hard problems. Thanks.
And then I'll take back to Garrett's point on, and I appreciate your comments on the amount of traffic we get in, reinforcing what I had said earlier. What I'll commit to actually is I'd love to, this is such a unique time, and this crisis is, not unprecedented, but it's unprecedented in kind of the level of complexity that it's even presenting to an organization as large as the federal government. What I would love to do is work with you and Sam and other people on the call that have domain expertise in here to build that consortium you mentioned. We're doing that now around open data and harmonizing data related to the Ebola response. We're actually getting the kind of global community and the NGOs together to really bring harm to the data. I'd love to do that same thing on rapid diagnostics. And I too, like you, have reached out to the 6 different agencies of government that are closely tied to this, and I'm not seeing the rapidness that we want to see in the space. And so, as a follow-up to this, I very much be excited about joining an effort and kind of getting everyone on the same page. The caveat that I'll always place on it is leaving your business cards at the door, and I'm not claiming that you or any of the folks in this group. We see a lot of traffic come in for people that are just sort of obviously wanting to sell products versus kind of new approaches or new solutions to this really tough problem. And so I'd love to work with you and others in the community to go do that and do it in more of a one-to-many kind of scenario than it is a many-to-many.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit, Steve? Because what would a consortium? How does that work? Or how has it been working in the data situation, and how could you imagine it working here? Just to give us a little more meat on those bones, and then I'd love to hear from the tech crew here about what they think of that.
Great. And in the data front, what it basically has worked out is first getting an assessment of who are the players, like who are the people, and laying out some requirements related to that. So if they have field deployable technology, if they have systems that are already being used and can be expanded upon. In data, it's a little bit different versus rapid diagnostics, given that PCR is the gold standard of the diagnostic world for Ebola today, but requires a vial of blood in 24 hours, and so to run through versus 10 to 20 minutes, which is really the nirvana state we want to get to. So what I would first do is work with a small group of leadership to go get an assessment of who's out there, who's doing what. And I think we have a pretty good assessment of that. We've got a tracker where we've been tracking a lot of the diagnostic tests. 2 is get those people in a room to understand what do we need to do to catalyze this moment. And I think for that it's about getting the right R&D and lab work done in field, access to samples, access the emergency authorizations from the medical related agencies of government to move those balls forward, but do that in a consensus way, and then go out into the field and prove this out with real science. We can get the tests in and understand what's happening. This person that I put into Liberia, who's running our innovation cell as part of our DART team, actually ran an epidemiological lab in Monrovia for 7 years. So he's has some domain expertise in the space. From there, I'd want to then go out and then understand options for manufacture. So if we were able to build and end on a technology that we could be deployable, how fast could we get the thing built at scale so we could actually take it into the field and run it? What's nice about, of course, working with the U.S. government is a lot of the requirements around power and communications and other things. In the time of crisis, we can actually address those while looking at second-order effects and more longer-term effects of how do you build more sustainable health systems and all of that for the region.
Awesome. Sam, jump in.
I wanted to go back to Steve's. I think that it's good that what we have to do in the short term is to take things that are on the shelf and adapt them and take a satisficing type approach. There are certain things that we have to have, certain things that we can't have, and then we try and pick the best and the most rapidly available things among them, like cold chain or is one factor that was spoken of. Cost is another one. Throughput, which is something that a lot of these point of care devices are not very good at. By that I mean doing a lot of specimens at once or very rapidly, which is what you would need if you were, say, screening people for a clinical trial, or you had screening a bunch of people with fever who was coming in. In terms of the medium and longer range development, things that really aren't ready to go now, one thing I think is we have to pay attention to the future. A lot of the things we have now are from seeds that were planted some time ago, and it may well be that this particular outbreak is going to be contained than we fear, in which case the development we have that we're going to make should clearly be multi-use in intent from the outset.
Okay, Kevin, jump.
Sure. So just a couple of things. Part of what we're talking about here is having lots of information and being able to share that information. So one of the things I did, I was working with the Army, is putting together a spreadsheet of all the sensors that I had heard of and all the diagnostic devices. So for example, the one that I put together for BioSense has about 200 entries in it with all the different parameters of, okay, biofire device, PCR-based device, et cetera, what are all the parameters, power required in capacity samples, and all those sorts of things that we talked about. And I started talking with parts and other agencies and getting their data in. And we started basically building this huge spreadsheet of every sensor we had heard about or we were funding, et cetera, and sharing that across our peers in government. That's what we're talking about here. We'd love to have a big parameterized spreadsheet that we could say, well, what are all of the things out there in government, academia, and industry that might be a PCR technology that's at, you know, some high TRL or availability level where we could actually field deploy it, and how can we put that together with the ability to transmit that data from anywhere and be able to get that data out so that we can all kind of coordinate our actions a little bit better. So that's what I wanted to throw out there. Happy to share this spreadsheet with anybody here on the call, but it seems like that sort of information now enables us to make better decisions and be more aware of what is actually happening out there.
Got you. All right, Michael, do you want to jump in? You had something that's out there. I'm hearing you, Kevin, and we will actually pull that into the thread here. Michael, go ahead.
Well, no, I think it's interesting. Sam raised an interesting point that this not be, if you will, a one-off. And I remember when we were dealing with the H1N1 concerns about the United States and a potential pandemic, there were a number of activities that stood up. A number of the same players that are now being involved with Ebola were involved, and then everyone sort of dispersed, and there was no standing capacity or dialogue or community involved. And you know, one of the questions that I would actually have is, what would it have taken for us to be where we are now a year ago with respect to Ebola? we knew this was happening there. We knew it had the potential for this kind of breakout. All of these things were known risks, and yet we didn't mobilize. This isn't a comment about government. This is a comment about all of us. Why did we not begin to mobilize more readily, more earlier about some of these issues? I mean, just the protective suit issue, if anyone had given it a little bit of thought, I think they would have known that the kinds of suits we use in labs and in most of the settings in the U.S. probably would be not as effective as we'd let a degree in high humidity weather in Sierra Leone. But we only got around to it later, and now we're playing catch up. So the question I would like to have is, how do we make sure we're not in the same situation 3-4 years from now when the next similar crisis occurs?
Totally interesting question. Actually, Claudia, I mean, so we've got Stephen from USAID kind of throwing out an interesting idea of how to get some infrastructure to respond quickly here. I mean, Claudia, do you have any other thoughts? I mean, Michael's comment here is like, what are we learning here, and what is something that, given the energy and hopefully now the budgets that's coming in around Ebola, could we actually build some kind of longer-term processes, longer-term infrastructure, use the focus of this to really provide a different kind of framework for dealing with this stuff going forward?
Let me highlight one approach and what it's interesting. I've been doing quite a bit of work around the question of how one might speed precision medicine over the last 6 months. And one of the key challenges is, and this will strike a chord with some of the conversations about data, is how siloed our data are from a healthcare standpoint, and that we need a way to create some kind of pre-competitive space or some kind of open sharing with requirements around use of that data and participate. So in a domestic case, we're talking about patients like me and being able to share your data and get something back and help direct the direction of science. But I really think that it's interesting around the Ebola science. There hasn't been enough science and data in this area. There is some good evidence, but what would it look like to have a new set of global norms for work that's funded, where there would be a requirement like Francis Collins put into his recently put into his grants, that you contribute back to a commons. And so is there a way that you can both take forward your product and share what you're learning with scientists worldwide? I don't claim to, this is something I'm just bringing forward personally. It's something we've been talking about. There are certainly examples in the United States, like Sage Bio Networks, that have been trying this in biopharma. But I'd be really interested, because I think some of the blockages are not sometimes they're government, sometimes they're the business models we have, but can we actually use policy and use this experience to nudge forward into the kinds of business models that would allow for more open sharing and more rapid development of the science? So I'd really appreciate hearing from others is that the right challenge to focus on? Are there good examples of that occurring in the world? How could we use policy to get to that outcome?
Actually, Garrett, how about, yeah, go ahead. Why don't you jump in?
So, the reason why I mentioned earlier that I think there's a need for a what I would call a rapid technology deployment capability is very much on the theme of what you see in DARPA, for instance, that there are civilian problems where in order to have the technology, in order to deal with a crisis, you have to have developed it beforehand. And you have to do more than simply spread out some development dollars. You need to have some production dollars. You need to actually get to the point where you're actually building something. And so to my way of thinking, one of the things that we can learn out of this crisis is that, if we want to be able to use what's going on in small companies, we need to think ahead of time on how to make that actually happen. And that involves more than, small SBRs or things of that sort. It involves enough funding to be able to actually do something with a sophisticated and complicated program.
One other thing, it sounds great. One thing though, Garrett, I was thinking, because you also are a venture capitalist and with a lot of, work with a lot of companies. What about her point about how do we get away from the business side, not just the government process side, but the business side of protecting IP at all times and being worried about, sharing what you're finding and stuff. I'm just curious how you see that dimension of her comment of how can we actually learn together at some level without getting too worried about damaging the business case of the business plan. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say at least in this instance, that isn't a prime concern, partially because it's a crisis and partially because, there is a certain amount of, normal times protect IP. So, the very FDA process is something which allows small companies to compete with large ones, right? Is that once you've entered into something, you can't catch up regardless of how big you are. And that's indeed what makes a lot of venture capital possible in this area. And so, frankly, the emergency use authorization, I think, is a benefit to small companies. It should be, but it only if there is enough of a commitment on the other side to actually do something. And by definition, you're making choices there, and of course, anyone who isn't chosen isn't going to be happy about that. So, in some sense, what I'm saying is that government has been overly concerned about that issue in order to be able to respond to the crisis, problem. And hence, I think we've underinvested in how do we respond quickly to crises to take advantage of small companies.
Stephen, you want to jump in also just to point out that you've been heavily involved in the private sector and also in the public sector. It'd be interesting to get your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I think on that point, I think there's really two sides to a lot of this stuff, and how the private sector and the public sector work together. I think time of crisis, we see a lot of innovation, we see a lot of things happening. American exceptionalism tends to happen when the going gets tough in this country. My favorite stat is over 50% of the Fortune 500 were founded in our worst economic times, and that really speaks to when these things are going on, when there's disruption in our society, then we tend to have innovators really kind of step up and rise to the challenge. And this is one of those opportunities. But I'd love to go back to the point you were raising earlier on kind of how do we make this, how do we set things up for the long term, and how do we bridge on that? People should really understand a place like West Africa and Liberia in particular is not like going into rural Virginia or across the mountains in California or things like that. It's a hostile environment. There are, and I mean hostile from the standpoint of you need ruggedized devices. You need there's not pervasive cell phone coverage. Power is mostly generator based and not very reliable. I was just in West Africa a few weeks ago, and it was very routine for the power just to go off and stay off for an hour or something like that, and then come back on. And I was in a city. In the rural areas, it's even more spotty, where you'll see locals climbing to the tops of trees to hold up their smartphone to try to get a signal for just a couple seconds to grab some SMS messages or things like that. It's all based on kind of market demand. So I think as we think about how do we build capability and kind of introduce technology, it should be more about how do we use innovation and bring common sense ideas to building out the infrastructure. Because as this part of Africa was actually a shining example of economic growth and prosperity in the last few years, and things like Ebola start to tip that over. How can we bring back those sort of aspects? And I think a lot of that's going to be on communications technology and understanding if we can help the local carriers and foster economic gain and help them grow those capabilities. That's sort of level one to get information out in the fingertips. Like we're finding out in Liberia that deploying social messaging, social activation, getting people to understand kind of how to deal with a person who has Ebola, how to identify it, how to separate yourself from them, how to not touch and shake hands and come into contact with dead bodies, or fluids that have come from a person that's infected, those kind of social norms are having a big effect. And if you have a communications infrastructure, that gets a lot easier. You have a communications infrastructure doing medical records, you understand that all those children that are now not going into medical clinics because they're afraid to and would have normally been getting vaccinated are not getting vaccinated for other routine diseases. If you have a communications infrastructure, you can start to track medical records and get your arms around that stuff. And so I think we have an imperative to look at novel approaches to clean energy, novel approaches to communications technology, and think about how to get the basics right as we think about how to deploy kind of new technology in diagnostics in the medical space as well.
Gotcha. Steve, the other Stephen, you wanted to jump in there with another question as well.
Yes. Earlier there was reference around the continuity of effort and how long-term will this be. I wanted to make the point that the epidemic in West Africa, which remains still at exponential growth rates, although there's been some recent signals of progress in Liberia, it's led to a change of thinking strategically here and in other parts of the world, Geneva and in West Africa itself, that the great mobilization that's underway right now in terms of deployment of U.S. troops, deployment of AID and CDC, UNMIR in Accra and the like, is likely to dampen and reduce the scope of this epidemic, but is not likely to extinguish it. That we're likely to be living over the long term in a situation with endemic Ebola in large urban settings with recurrent outbreaks and the like. And that has fed this drive towards putting a greater emphasis on accelerating technology. The big meeting at WHO on October 23rd was sort of the signal, the really main signal. And that gets, and when you look at the $6.1 billion request that the president put forward yesterday, which has probably somewhere between $700 and $800 million in new money on accelerating development of technologies, that is another sign of the degree to which we're in this over an extended period of time. The tests, though, for all of these are going to be their ability to actually demonstrate results in ending transmission, in contributing to the isolation and containment of people who are exposed or at risk, and contributing to the other measures that are needed in order to arrest this. And that's where the vaccine is getting huge amount of priority right now, and the diagnostics are getting much higher priority. But I think at the end of the day, people are going to be asking very hard questions around the fit that these technologies are going to have in getting deployed, most of which are not going to be available for quite a while in any effective, scaled, and safe manner. Thanks.
Let's a lot of interesting things emerging here, but let's just, I think one of the things, the key issue that we were trying to hit here was trying to see how can we accelerate moving technologies more systematically, quicker into these processes. And again, thinking big picture, if this is not just the only pandemic we might be facing going on, can we maybe go back to Claudia and just think? So and start thinking, like, what are the elements of some of these things? And maybe some of the technologists here too could be thinking, like, what would really make this work? What are the things we could actually do to improve the system now? Are there kind of, what's the characteristics of this thing, or even some of the elements that you'd like to see that are doable even in the next year or two? Any thoughts from the panel on that? Maybe, I don't know, Claudia, I thought since you're kind of at the apex of a lot of this, you had some earlier some interesting thoughts on that, but
yeah, let me talk maybe a little bit about. I think we're in periods like this there's an abundance of attention, and there's even, I would say, quite a bit of funding. And one of the challenges is how to, not necessarily in a top-down way, but in a effective way, put your money and effort in the highest value things and coordinate across those. And that is one of the roles we at the White House and OSDP, we are not the executors and implementers of the key strategies here, but to constantly be kind of stepping back and asking, what are the next things that need to be developed? How are we going to scale those? Is there going to be a need for do the existing regulatory pathways work? It is something that is a conversation. We're sort of an interesting agency because we actually explicitly can have more open kind of conversation both across government and also with the private sector, and that's something that we're actively trying to do. I don't see a silver bullet here, though, and one of the challenges is going to be when you, I know with the ZMAP development, ZMAP, growing things on tobacco is a slow, painstaking process, right? Doing clinical trials in the field, even in rapidly, takes a lot of effort and a lot of operationalization. So I think we need, I want to go back to the point I made before. I think we need the world to help us prioritize. It's almost, yeah, we're smart in government, but if it's just up to us to say this is absolutely the most important and this isn't, and we have the funding and the regulatory mechanisms to do that, but how could we tap into a broader set of intelligence? Because I do worry, we have, so many different diagnostic tests that are coming forward. Vaccines, there are a lot fewer of them in development, but I think we need the world to help shape priorities here, and I'm not, I'd love your thoughts on how to do that.
Garrett or Kevin, I think that's a good tee up. What's from the private sector folks here? What are the elements that would have been helpful for you and are helpful for you to actually right now that she's actually teeing up? Help. What would you like to see? What are the aspects of kind of changes that would be useful?
Well, one of the things that I keep seeing, having gone through lots of old H5N1, H1N1. Now we're talking about Ebola, but we've got endemic dengue in certain areas. We've got cholera. We've got other issues. Just stepping back from this conversation a little bit, again, being the big picture thinker here, that it feels like we're in Groundhog Day. We're seeing the same thing happen again and again. And as someone was just mentioning a moment ago, PEPFAR was a great program to allow us to start to get a lot of diagnostics and a lot of capabilities in certain parts of Africa and around the world to address that. But what I'd love to see is us to step back and generalize a little bit and say, okay, what is it that we really need to do? We need to get diagnostic information from remote places, and we need to be able to coordinate our actions there. And not have this kind of crisis du jour, but just step back and generalize to prevent and look forward to that next pandemic that we're going to be dealing with. Let's pick 5 years from now. What if we knew that there was going to be a major pandemic 5 years from now? What pieces are we going to need to have in place? We're going to need diagnostics. We're going to need to be able to get data from the field, no matter whose diagnostic device it is. And there are a bunch of PCR and other sensors and other diagnostic devices out there. We're going to need to coordinate our actions. We're going to need to have policy and processes in place. We're going to need to do a bunch of different things that we can leverage from our previous experience and now say, let's prepare for the next big pandemic.
Love that idea. Garrett, did you have thoughts on what are the pieces you'd like to see emerging in place?
Well, my main reaction is that, sometimes good cases make bad law. That you've got to invest in a general capacity, and then you have to invest in the ability to be very, very flexible and very fast. I think Claudia is absolutely right that we need a constant discussion of priorities here, and then you need the ability to fund people who are actually doing things. We could have built a general purpose point-of-care diagnostic, 2 years ago, but there wasn't the crisis du jour that to cause the level of funding we're currently talking about. And if this crisis didn't happen right now, I don't think that we'd be having this conversation either. So the important thing is to put in that generalized capacity to respond very quickly and to invest enough periodically to actually have capability to respond to the scenarios you think are, probable.
Hear you, Michael. You had a thought.
Yeah. So the last speakers are all spot on. I mean, this is the classic problem of what we refer to as a low probability, high impact event. If you look at the amount of money we could have spent on preparing for something like Hurricane Sandy relative to the costs for not preparing, the problem is forward investing on these things tends to be difficult in many environments. However, I think there are technical standing capacities that would be incredibly valuable. There's also, really important capacity that needs to be put into place in terms of the very public health systems, both in these developing nations, the ministries of health, and in the United States. Eric Gooseby, the former ambassador to PEPFAR, has been very active in trying to look at core strengthening of the public health community in the markets where you're likely to have these kinds of illnesses. The public health system in Sierra Leone is actually pretty good in the capital, but the field capabilities are very weak. Likewise, in the United States, I'm afraid to say, our public health system at one level is not sufficiently funded. So if you were to have an epidemic outbreak and someone called the local public health office on an weekend evening, you're likely to get an answering service or someone with a pager. And so the real question is, where do we want to put our investments technically and in standing capacity so that we are able to respond? And I think it's a real budgetary and policy question.
So one part of my background I didn't share, which is I lived for 2.5 years in a small village in Burkina Faso running a child survival project. And in most of the villages I worked in, there was not aspirin available even for sale. There was Coke, there was beer, but there was no aspirin. And so I just think as we step back and think about what it really means to be in a low resource environment, so even if we have a super cheap diagnostic, even if we have a super cheap vaccine, our vaccination rates in the villages I worked in for the basic childhood vaccines was somewhere on the order of 50–60%. So I want to go back to something Steve said, which is that what we're seeing now are some bending of the curve. Some people think because social norms are starting to change and folks are supporting each other in behavior change, whether that's supporting care in a community setting in a centralized place, or safer burial, or encouraging people to go to treatment centers. And I just want to say, I just think that communication infrastructure, not just to educate people, but to, in a very deep way, support those communities to make the changes they need to make to be healthy, and figure out how we use the resources we're spending now so that these countries can, at the end of the day, get themselves back on their feet and progress economically. So I just think we have to be both extremely passionate about changing, but also very realistic about what a resource-poor environment looks like. If you can't get aspirin, if you can't get ibuprofen, if you can't get an IV, I don't think that a rapid diagnostic is going to be the cure-all for that community. So how can we think about another set of strategies to support that?
Sam, you want to jump in?
I was just going to endorse the idea of improving general capabilities, because it's really not when or if there's going to be another pandemic, it's when. The periodicity of the zoonotic infections jumping from animals to people is shortening, and we can all now think of many of them over the past few years: SARS, hantavirus, etc. And the root causes for these things happening: the rise of megacities, the movement of exotic vectors from one area to another, climate change, increased transportation. So there are lots of areas to intervene in the probability of having another outbreak, and there are certain things we know we're going to need if there is one: trained personnel, improved public health infrastructure everywhere, as well as a broad array of technological capabilities that we can pull off the shelf and purpose towards fighting the next outbreak, which is coming shortly for sure.
I love that point. Now, someone raised it earlier too, about to what extent we plan for the next one in 5 years. So as much as I understand the broader, global development of these countries and stuff, given the resource constraints in the United States and various things, what happens if in those 5 years it's hitting the United States? Let's just pull it back from this immediate thing in West Africa and think, you know, what if there's something happening in this country and it's moving faster than we have now? Let's just say, just not to, you know, get too amp it up too much here, but like, what are the elements we need to have in place for that one? And are there things we're learning here that we would we'd want to be able to do? So it's not, we're not worried about, because legitimate problems of how do you isolate it in Africa, but you know, what happens, you know, if we have to do it closer to home even? Is there any thoughts to that? I mean, we're getting to the point of the conversation here. It's just to kind of broaden, looking out in the future a little bit here is, you know, what do we need to get in place in case it's closer to home? Any thoughts on that from folks who've been thinking about this big picture piece of it? Michael.
Well, I was just remembering 1918 and the pandemic there. So, I mean, the fact that this is something that could be quickly occurring is not a science fiction. And I think Sam Bozzette is entirely right. It's only a matter of when. So I guess there are a few things. One would be, I think if one could deal with some core strengthening of the public health system, because getting mobilized early is really important. The second is having the general public be a little bit more aware about what basic hygiene and the kinds of things they can undertake. We talk about West Africa, but we probably have forgotten about basic hygiene in the United States in a way that would slow the spread of certain kinds of infections. The different modes of transmission obviously make the hygiene issues variant. But the other, I think, would really be creating a standing capacity and exercising it on an annual basis, the same way the military does around a number of different areas, around this kind of scenario. The people on the call, probably each one of them could identify another network group. Funding that kind of standing capacity, I think, would be incredibly valuable to allow us to be better prepared.
Okay, Garrett.
Yeah, I would like to see us have the capacity at the airports to test for these conditions. You know, when I'm a pilot, when I fly myself into the country, some guy comes out from customs who has a radiation detector, and it's obviously because somebody has thought through that scenario. But there are vast, you know, the likelihood of having something like this transmitted from overseas is not only, you know, it's a certainty, and indeed it happened very quickly in this scenario. And you know, at the moment, effectively, our best technology is something that was developed during the SARS epidemic, which was remote monitoring of temperature. That's nice, but it hardly discriminates in a way that's meaningful. And everything else, you know, and we're going to need something that's fast. Because obviously you have large volumes. Next time around, it won't just be 150 people a day. It's going to be a lot more. And you can't turn off global commerce. You know, the real cost of this economically, you know, is in terms of its impact on globalization. So we need to be able to respond swiftly.
Stephen with a V and then Stephen with a P.
Even though I work for the Agency for International Development, I'll make a domestic comment. Maybe I work for ADD instead of AID. I don't know. I think one of the other things we should think about, and this is probably more about the social science and how we think about social communications, is the level of public discourse. If an epidemic or something was to start to emerge in the United States, how we talk about it, how we get people educated, how we kind of convey common sense things to do related to it are the utmost importance. And it kind of goes back to Michael's point a little bit as well. But if you look at the way sort of Ebola rolled out in this country, we had people, you know, very, very afraid of interacting with other people, going to airports, dealing with others, when the likelihood that any person in the United States is going to contract Ebola was infinitesimally low. I mean, we had 2 people that were infected, and we know exactly why they were infected, and so the risk versus kind of perception aspects of how that permeates out has really big effects. In the United States, when we're shown on the news, quarantining a health worker that doesn't present symptoms, that discourages other health workers to go to Africa and help on this. And by discouraging other health workers to go to not going to Africa, all of a sudden you have this phenomenon of making the problem worse if you're not dealing with the problem at the source. And so thinking about that level of discourse, it's probably a much bigger discussion than we can get into today, but it's something I think we need to think about relative to how do we actually communicate and get the word out to people on hygiene and other aspects if something was like this was to rise up again.
Gotcha. Stephen, the other Stephen. Oops, you're muted there, Stephen, sorry.
As a non-USG person, but based here in Washington, I think it's important to make one point, which is that across this town, a multitude of agencies have been turned upside down by Ebola and have really risen to the occasion, including USAID and the White House staff itself. CDC's got 700 people deployed domestically, 150 deployed in the field in Liberia. PEPFAR has assigned something like 10 or 20% of its personnel into the fight. We can go on. FDA's got 250 people working on this. I think it's important to understand the degree to which this has lit up and turned upside down multiple agencies of the U.S. government at a price in terms of other things that could or should be, that are priority things that could or should be be done on a regular basis. And how sustainable is that going to be looking forward? The second point, which is about the surprising and very promising development, I think, in addition to U.S. leadership, which has been pretty exceptional in this period, is that a number of non-traditional actors, most of them out of the West Coast Foundation side, have jumped into this in a very big way. The Gates Foundation, not so surprising because they're already deeply invested in much of the science and the development of these, but putting $50 million on the table, having Bill Gates out at the ASTMH conference on Sunday, delivering a major speech. But Paul Allen putting $126 million into the pot, Zuckerberg 25, Hewlett another 5. This amounted to a handful of agencies that are non-traditional actors putting over $200 million in quick dispersing money, much of it really focused upon technology and facilitation and answering quick needs that complemented and helped expedite those other processes, which are slightly more slow-moving in terms of the USG processes. And I think that's quite innovative and quite promising, and something that needs to be commended, but also factored into the big picture thinking about the way that U.S. institutions respond in this period. We wouldn't have seen that 10 years ago in a situation like this. Thank you.
I love that actually perspective. And it's interesting. I'd be curious for some of the more private sector folks to actually comment on that. I mean, Garrett maybe has a thought on that. I mean, it is interesting. We're watching immense wealth actually being built out here, but we're also watching it used in new ways and very productive ways in response to new things, challenges like this. It's possible that a system could evolve potentially outside of government that could, maybe work in sync with it or something, or as an advanced guard, or there might be some kind of way that we might think in the 21st century of a different way of an experimental wing that's funded by private sector money or something, and a public sector side to scale it. Anyhow, Garrett, what do you think about that idea of the more the private sector taking the lead on, particularly as he mentioned? That's an interesting point we hasn't come up yet. Or does anyone have a thought on that?
Well, I think if you have to guard against the fact that these things become institutions in and of themselves. They're funding ongoing programs, et cetera, et cetera. So I really like the idea of coalitions of the moment appearing, and maybe having some kind of coordinating body to pull new money in and new players in who don't really have, who aren't really tied to existing programs to too much of an extent. The Wellcome Trust is private. It acts an awful lot like the NIH. But in this situation, Gates and some of these new monies, they've already moved to set up clinical trials programs, de novo things that the NIH or the Wellcome Trust couldn't walk away from their existing commitments to do. So this, it seems to me that the way of having fora that would pull these people together would be one model that could be promising.
Interesting. Kevin, did you have a thought on that?
Yeah, just to again generalize that, really, if you can share your resources and coordinate your actions across these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, government agencies, private sector, etc., you can, if you share your resources, coordinate actions, you can really get sort of a force multiplier effect here, where 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 or 10. So that was just a kind of big picture that I wanted to share.
Gotcha. Well, or Garrett, you were about to jump in. Did you have some to add on that? Sorry.
You know, I think that we should. It's absolutely wonderful what Gates and Paul Allen and et al. Skoll Foundation and so on have done. But I also don't think it's a great way to build permanent capacity going forward. I think, you know, the U.S. government is, you know, orders and orders and orders of magnitude bigger, and so you want to do a great job of using these folks as episodically as a crisis develops, and it's great that they step forward. But in terms of things that you can plan on, I think the onus needs to be on building that capacity within the government and funding it.
Gotcha. Well, anyhow, we've come to this. This has been a fantastic conversation. Got right 0 to 60. All of it kind of really pushing the envelope on what can be done here. But we've come to the point where we're kind of coming to the end of the session here. And given the group here, what I was hoping we'd kind of end with is just to go around the table, kind of like we did in the beginning. But in this case, for everyone to kind of think about what they thought emerged here that really struck them as the most useful or interesting, or what they learned here. And then also, given what we're talking about here, what would be some of the next steps you could see to build on some of the ideas that went here? Or what would you like to see to kind of improve the situation going forward? Any thoughts on that? And we're going to touch on everybody here, but why don't we start with, I don't know, how about Kevin? Do you want to jump in, and we'll start a lineup of, just take about a minute or so, just your final thoughts on the idea.
Yeah, no pressure. Part of what I think that I really got out of this, and it's put together a tremendous panel. I've actually learned a lot from people, and I apologize for some of the technical issues I had with our network here. But I think part of what I got out of this is really the broader perspective, and it's a multifaceted issue, that we need to look all the way from building human capacity and our intergovernmental collaboration between all kinds of different peoples, but then also needing to look all the way down to, as Claudia mentioned a little while ago, if you can't even get protective gear, gloves, etc., diagnostics don't matter as much. So what I really got out of this was a much broader perspective. Policy, processes, all those things need to be in place, government level collaboration, all the way down to the technologies, and involving, as we were just talking about, really the private sector and private philanthropy as well. So that was the big thing that I got out of this. As far as going forward, maybe we should, just to throw out a crazy idea, talk about Pandemic 2020 and pick the name of what that pandemic's going to be, and just say, okay, we've somehow looked into a crystal ball. There will be a pandemic. We'll call it the Pendex. I just made that up. Pendex influenza, respiratory-borne hemorrhagic fever. Just throw something out there crazy. What if we knew that was going to happen in just a few years? What would we do now? Because it will happen. We just don't know exactly when and its nature. So that might be sort of a lightning rod for galvanizing some of our efforts. Tremendous efforts that are going on right now for this particular event, but how can we step back and generalize, and that may help. So just making that up as I go along, those are some thoughts. Love
that idea. Maybe we do another roundtable on just that idea. Stephen, You wanna do your Stephen, maybe with a okay, a PH. You're ready. You're teed up there. I can see. Go ahead.
Closing thoughts. Get back to the fact that U.S. leadership and engagement in this period has been the pivotal and essential factor in shaping the global response to this. And the scale of commitment and the mobilization has been unprecedented and quite exceptional. One of the problems that this begs is, does it set off enough introspection and review around how to change those practices? I think it does. I think it's put sufficient stress on institutions in multiple ways that process has already begun. And I think we should fix upon that and use that moment for an introspection and process of rethinking along the lines that I think, Peter, you're suggesting. Second is, we need to get others in the game. We can't carry this load to the way in the direction that it is moving right now. There needs to be many, many others in the game, more than there are today. The president's going out to the East Asia Summit, the APEC Summit. He'll be in Beijing. He'll be in Yangon. These issues are going to surface, these issues around shared responsibility, including in technological innovation and commitments and funding and the like. We are shouldering too big a burden, I believe, in this. The third closing point is we should be tracking this progress and thinking ahead. This is not a 5 or 6 month turnaround like SARS. This is going to be with us for a while. We've got 4,000 U.S. troops deploying out there, not all there yet, but they're going to be there. That's unprecedented. We should be thinking beyond the next 12 to 18 month period and attempting to track progress and shape the dialogues at different key moments along that way. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks to have there. The other, Stephen.
All right, thank you. And I agree with everything everyone said in the wrap-up. I think the key takeaways for me were really around the closer points of collaboration. I think we've done that pretty effectively on data, on the personal protective equipment work that we've done that Claudia described, and we're now emerging in a really good cohesive strategy around the communications and ICT sector in West Africa, which I hope will lead us to more kind of innovation across the board. And so looking at that, I think that's my real key takeaway is to work on the rapid diagnostic side with a closer level of collaboration, like the plays we've been running in those other categories. And then the other, kind of next step for me beyond that is really thinking about how do we, work with the community, with all of you and others on really kind of the call to action for Americans to step up, not only on the financial side and giving to organizations that are being involved in Ebola specifically, but getting the best ideas, the best technologies, the best other things kind of coming forward. I would encourage all of you and the people watching this to go to ebolagrandchallenge.net, which is our website that's capturing ideas and all of that to kind of roll up into one place. It's a place that you can collaborate and get lots of innovation sort of happening. We run it on a platform that's been pretty popular, and we've been breaking records on that platform already with the hundreds of ideas that are coming in. Hopefully, from this we'll get even more. So thank you.
Great. Plus, you actually put out the idea of this working group, which we'll follow up on as well.
Yes.
Michael. About a minute, we're getting to the end here, so about a minute or so.
Yeah, real quickly. I think in 1939, the President of the United States got together with the leaders of American industry and executed something called the Grand Strategy, and it was around America as the arsenal of democracy. And that's why when we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, 3 months later, we were turning tanks out of a Ford Motor Factory rather than taking a year to ramp up. I think a government-led private-public partnership around Ebola as a starting point, but really understanding, as Sam and others have said, that this is just a rehearsal opportunity, I think is really the thing that I take away from this. The second thing, and I want to emphasize this, is understanding that in markets or places like Sierra Leone or upcountry in Liberia, the environment is totally different than the United States, and the technologies, the heterogeneity of the technologies that are out there become impediments to our deployments successfully. Of the 6 mobile health systems I know operating in that region, there's no common ontology. The data is all incompatible. And there's really no way to coordinate these things without doing an overlay, which is really expensive. So some pre-planning, some careful thinking, and looking at this as something akin to a military level issue, I think would really stead us well in the future.
Terrific. Sam?
I'm worried about the future more than anything. I think that our most important, well, first stifling this epidemic, but our next most important task is learning from it. There are many places in the world where there are shockingly inadequate health systems, and there are many kinds of infections that are much more contagious than this one. Not too many that are more lethal, but this is a relatively small outbreak in a relatively isolated part of the world with relatively hard to get infection. So I think things that are as virulent and more contagious are coming along, and probably less additional, at least as tough circumstances. So to me, the challenge is learning from this for the future, and how to bring technology to bear, but also how to empower the medical personnel in the field, how we can get the right technologies to them as well.
Awesome comment. Garrett?
So I just want to second Michael's comments. I think that the key thing here is to think about this in somewhat military terms. I too use the analogy of the arsenal of democracy, but I think it's true in a larger sense. The military puts an enormous amount of emphasis on training and on training on scenarios. And I think that fits with everything we've discussed here in terms of thinking about the next epidemic. The other thing is that the military has been the only area of the U.S. government that I can see has been really effective at leading technologies through not only development grants but also through production grants. So DARPA is a model that we can build on to say, how is it that we will be ready with the right kinds of equipment come the next crisis? And finally, and I guess this is the military analogy too, I think that the healthcare workers here should be given sainthood. And we don't do enough just talking about how these folks sitting out there who are working in these countries are really on the absolute front lines, and we need to commend them.
Hear, hear. And Claudia?
It's always fun to go last because you can just +1 all the great ideas that have come forward. There's a little story that I think is an instructive one. There's a communal Google Doc that's sourcing all the best data for Ebola, and it has its own Skype chat that goes almost all the time. And my colleagues, Steve included, and others, we can't actually access Google Docs, but decided to host a public call just for those folks to see if we could better connect inside and outside and just quickly answer questions twice a week on a call. And I guess my invitation to all of you is invite us in and tell us where to go for the conversation. We don't always have to be the host. And we need those conversations and as I said before, priority setting and discoveries to happen. We can't always be the one to host the dinner party, but invite us to yours and we will gladly participate. I think this concept of whatever pandemic 2020 and a foundational effort to prepare for the future is one that's critically important. And again, it's going to require the participation not just of us, but of everyone. We've seen how hard it is across a distributed healthcare system to quickly raise people's skills in something like PPE doffing. And we probably need some new tools to figure out how to quickly, how to kind of over time develop the plan and test it in a way that's both rigorous and distributed. And I think that's really important. I agree also with Steve's point that this is a global call to action. The U.S. is doing a lot, and we need, and the contributions of the private sector are an elemental part of that, and we're going to have to work together to make that coordinated and effective over time. I guess the last point is just we need to deal with the urgencies of the epidemic on the ground, but I also want to be sure we're investing so that we're leaving something behind in those communities in West Africa, and that they can take that and grow from that. And that, you know, I was so struck in our PPE work that having someone in the room who was actually using the equipment, so having the actual people affected have a strong voice in the solution, and that's hard to do when you're talking about folks in villages in West Africa, but we need to be sure that we're not losing the voice of the communities, not just here, but there, that are most profoundly affected by this disease. So keep the ideas flowing. Please email me, and I will share with others. I love the idea of consortia, including on rapid diagnostics, to share our thinking and knowledge. And thanks so much. This has been a lot of fun.
That's been great. Oh, thank you so much, everybody. A lot of great ideas in here. We will build on them. And then for those, just to remind everyone, you can always watch the entire thing here. You can get we're going to get a 10-minute recap. We'll get a 2-minute video. We'll have write-ups on the social media, put it together. It's a package that we can share, get this in the hands of the right people. There's a lot of great ideas in here. Let's build on them, and we're going to do this. So we'll follow up. Thank you, everyone, and see you another time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.